Welcome to the fifth and final lecture in the Understanding the EU series. And as usual, on behalf of the University of Victoria Retirees Association and Elder Academy, it's my pleasure to extend another warm welcome to everyone this Saturday morning. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Amy Verdun, who comes to us from UVic, and I will introduce Dr. Verdun in a moment. But before doing so, I want to, as usual, to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we live here in the capital region of BC, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, whose historical relationships with the land and the sea continue to this day. So with this being the last lecture in the series, I can imagine that this time next Saturday morning, you will be at a loss to know what to do with yourselves. We at Elder Academy hope you have enjoyed this series and that you now feel more informed about what the EU is and how it functions. The EU seems to be tested at almost every turn, and today this will be clearly illustrated by Professor Verdun as she outlines how COVID has impacted the EU. I think you know the format which we will follow over the next 1 to 2 hours, but today's session will be a bit different because Amy was key to putting the series together with me, and we did so earlier this year. I think it was June, several months ago now. And it might be appropriate for Amy to wander a little bit to present some of her summary thoughts about the EU as we bring the series to a close. We do urge you to ask questions and as usual, to participate in discussion after the break, and of course, to use the chat line at any time. If I don't get to all your chat line questions asked by me, I do apologize. I'm not very proficient at multitasking, so please unmute your microphone and jump in. So today we'll look at the EU from the perspective of COVID. Now, this lecture aims to explain the political and economic responses of the EU to the pandemic, to assess the implications of this crisis on the institutions, policies, and politics of the EU, and to draw lessons from it relating to these findings to long-standing debates in EU studies and political science. This crisis has profound and far-reaching implications, including for the EU and its citizens. And we have no better person to explain this to us than Dr. Amy Verdun. Amy Verdun is Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the European Studies program at the University of Victoria, and has served as chair of the department for several years. And she's been a faculty member at UVic since 1997, coming up to 25 years. She was on leave from 2018 to 20, during which time she served as Professor of European Politics and Political Economy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And in July 2017, she was awarded the first Distinguished Lansdowne Fellow of UVic's Faculty of Social Sciences. And it's a position that's given to an established researcher in recognition of outstanding internationally recognized contributions to scholarship in the area of expertise. Dr. Verdun holds a PhD in political and social sciences from the European University Institute in Florence in Italy. And her earlier appointments were at the University of Leiden and at the University of Essex in England. She's published in numerous scholarly journals and refereed articles for several journals, and she's the author of several recent books on European Union governance and policy making. And she has served in various capacities in professional associations and as a member of several advisory boards. Well, so we are pleased that you've agreed to present to us as part of our Understanding the EU series, Amy, and welcome to Elder Academy. And so the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the audience for being here again after a couple of really interesting and thought-provoking talks that we've had over the past weeks. I'd like to acknowledge my other scholars that have presented here before. I I'm honored to have been followed or preceded by talks by Valerie Derman, Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, Paul Schuer, Keith, and I'm now in the fifth position to talk to you today about the European Union. So as John kindly reminded us, we thought about this series back in June, and the view was to do it in 1.5 years' time. And then we were privileged to pull it forward and now have this sort of November-December series to talk about the EU. And when we were talking about the various slots where we could possibly fill people in, I was first thinking I should do the first one to introduce you all to the EU and give you an overview of the various dimensions of the European Union. In the end, we figured it was better to do it this way. And when I got the opportunity of doing the closing talk, I thought it would maybe be nice to bring these various issues together and then speak about the big elephant in the room, the COVID-19 pandemic that is before all of us in the globe. So the title I gave John is the one that you see before you. So the COVID-19 and the EU, game changer or same old. It is inspired in part by research that I was planning to do anyway at the time when we were thinking about this in June. And I've put on my slide here, I wanted to acknowledge the work by Lucia Quaglia from the University of Bologna that I've been doing in the past couple of months, in fact, on the COVID-19 pandemic in the EU. And the poster that you see here, this beautiful blue slide with the flag and the corona image, has been produced by the European University Institute. We're doing a workshop next week in Florence, we hope we can get there, on this very topic. And I wanted to introduce a bit of that also as I go to my slides. So what I wanted to talk about today are the implications of the COVID-19 crisis on EU institutions, policies, and politics. And so the crisis that was generated by the COVID-19 pandemic has raised in the EU context a number of really important questions. First is to kind of see sort of empirically, how has the EU responded to the pandemic and why? What have been the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular on the institutions, policies, and politics of the EU. And then as scholars, we're always interested in what can we learn from a particular case study for the broader phenomenon. And I was very happy to hear John inviting me towards the end, maybe after my formal presentation in the second half of our time together, to maybe think a little bit more about these more broader questions. But in the slides, I have a little bit on the theoretical lessons, but I think we may also want to just speak about the EU more generally. And then, as I mentioned at the bottom of this first slide, I have mentioned a SSHRC project, so Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, so one of the tri-councils that funds research in Canada. You've seen also Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly mentioning his SSHRC-funded project, a different one than this one. So mine is with Lucia Quaglia and myself, and in fact, my colleague Eric Jones is a collaborator on this one as well. So here is the conference that we're doing on the 9th and the 10th of December in Florence. It's needless to say a hybrid conference. Not everybody feels comfortable to go. But what we did was to bring together what I would argue are among the leading people in the globe on the EU and the COVID-19 pandemic. So our research project has broken up this understanding of the EU and the pandemic into different components. And so we were privileged enough to be able to obtain the right to be special issue editors of a journal. The journal's European of Public Policy is one of the journals, academic field journals that discusses public policy of European Union countries or European countries more generally. And so this workshop brings together people who are writing in that special issue. And so we have obviously our opening piece, which is what I'm presenting to you here today. Then we have a piece by Hussein Kassim that looks at the European Commission. We have two practitioners, Marco Butti from the European Commission, and actually one practitioner and his collaborator, Sergio Fabrini, who are looking at this new funding opportunity that the EU has produced to help finance the measures taken at the EU level to combat the economic crisis that is emerging or has been emerging in combination with the COVID-19 pandemic. So Marco Butti is Sergio Fabrini. Sergio Fabrini is a professor at Lewis University in Rome. Then we have a piece that Lucia Quaglia and myself have prepared. That's a scholarly piece on the role of the European Central Bank. We have invited Dorothea Bole, Bela Kreskovic, and Marek Naznik from the University of Oxford to talk about Europe's rule of law crisis. So some of the responses by member states have been to become more authoritarian and limit the freedom of the courts and freedom of journalists and universities. And so that piece discusses this dimension that's been taking place already from before COVID. Then we have a piece by Scott Greer and his colleagues on health policy. So particularly focusing on how health has developed in the EU context. A final event that I would like to invite you all to attend if you're interested in is a round table called The Pandemic in Canada in Comparative Perspective. This is an event on the 9th of December, locally at 4 o'clock, which in BC is 7 o'clock in the morning, rather early, from 7 to 9 a.m. in the morning in BC on next Thursday, the 9th of December. But we've put that part in the program to invite anybody who wanted to be learning more about what we're doing to be a participant. So it's an outreach event that we're doing. It's going to be streamed as a webinar online. And our speakers include Ailish Campbell, the Canadian ambassador to the European Union, who holds a doctorate from Oxford University. And she will speak as ambassador on how Canada has dealt with the pandemic. And the other three speakers are distinguished Canadian scholars. One is Frédéric Méran of the University of Montreal, who looks at Canada-EU comparison on COVID dimension. Third speaker is Kathy Brock, who's at a policy school looking at action, accountability, and good governance during the COVID pandemic. And she focuses very explicitly on Canada. Some of you may have seen her work in policy documents, but also she's been in the media criticizing the way in which the Canadian government has dealt with it, particularly early on. And she's a forthcoming author on a book covering all of COVID matters, focusing specifically on Canada. And the final talk in that panel is by Lou Pauly, who used to be the director of the Monk School and also the head of the Department of the Political Science Department at University of Toronto. And he takes it more in a comparative perspective. So he looks at federations in crisis and at the Canadian response, but he will also focus on Australia, New Zealand, and a number of other similar countries to put that in perspective. Our second day, I'm not going to go into too much detail more at this point, but our second day focuses on a number of other dimensions like migration, crisis management, protests, and then we have a final wrap-up piece that looks at where do we go from here. So in my talk today, I would like to do these different points. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the pandemic. Then we'll focus on the EU responses, the effects of them, how this particular crisis was conceptualized as a symmetric crisis and what impact that had on the response. Then we'll do a bit of an analysis of the crisis and the response. Then we have a few specific novelties that I thought were interesting to highlight, in particular, the role of the European Central Bank, but also the Recovery and Resilience Facility and other forms of cooperation. Then I'll turn to some of the more sort of civil protests, draw some lessons, and then come to a conclusion. I'm going to try to wrap it up within the hour as we've done so far. But John, if I do go over time, maybe pull up a bell, interrupt, and let me know that I'm actually going over time. I've got my eye on the clock. I should be okay. Okay, so let me first put some perspective on what we have in mind here. The European moment of dealing with the COVID-19 crisis came in really harsh. Italy in the March 2020 period saw such a high death toll due to the COVID-19 crisis that it was the highest death toll since any other year since the Second World War. And just a personal anecdote on this situation, I was visiting Florence, which is where I did my PhD in the late 1990s, and I was there also as a researcher in the early 2000s. And I was visiting there in late February when all of this erupted. We were actually welcomed, so to say, by people in full white bodysuits with masks and everything when we landed the third week of February, because it had just erupted in all its severity in the north of Italy. And during our time, it was Carnival, and Italians enjoy going to the Carnival in Venice, for example, or in Viareggio. There were also some really large soccer matches. What was taking place in Florence, the soccer match that was coming in was from Milan, the north. And so we were there and realized very quickly that this was something that was going to be quite a bit bigger than what we had been hearing even just in the weeks prior when it came out in Wuhan, China. Florence and northern Italy had a really bad bout because they were the first to hit these large numbers of deaths, and they actually had to triangulate and decide who could be in the hospital and who could not. So this was a pandemic that broke out in Italy, also in France and Germany, but Italy had the biggest expansion quickly. And the European Union needed to decide what to do with this phenomenon. So it swiftly spread across the European continent, and the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic in the middle of March of 2020. And this here is a photo of the Director General who was reporting this to the world at large. So the COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost, obviously, a public health emergency. But the health emergency was dealt with by the members of the European Union and elsewhere across the globe in seeing it as a very infectious disease that could spread really rapidly if not contained in a more sort of public restrictive manner. And at first, just like in Canada, the response by the European Union member states to what was happening in China was, oh, this is not going to be happening in our place. Their first assessment in January was the likelihood of this coming to the European continent was low. A few days later, they changed that and said moderate. But there was a bit of an idea that this could just be kept over there and that they were, in a sense, responding quite dramatically, but, you know, it wasn't going to hit the rest of the world right away. I think part of that was because of the experience with SARS and MERS, other similar type diseases that had been relatively contained during the outbreak earlier and hadn't really kind of taken on this fully fledged pandemic hitting all corners of the globe. Now, the response was eventually to do what also was happening in China, namely the lockdowns. I don't have to tell anybody in this room what happened. We were all witnessing this. But the result of the lockdown obviously was that all kinds of economic activity was restricted. People like us right now, even as we are speaking to one another today, chose to move our work online, and we were able to do so. But of course, not all types of activities were able to be put online, and some things did shut down significantly. Factories were shut down, a lot of the service industry shut down, and the result was global growth was contracted more than ever had been seen before since the Second World War. Now, in the European Union context, the crisis posed an unprecedented challenge. This unprecedented challenge had a number of dimensions to it. Maybe the most important thing is that the European Union has competence, as we heard in the presentation by both Valerie Derman and subsequent speakers, in the area of the single market. But in the area of health policy, the EU does not have much competence. So national health policy is mostly national competence. What does that mean? We're in Canada and we're familiar with the Canadian system. So in the Canadian system, if you're looking at your health policy, many of the decisions are made at the provincial level. So we are, our hospitals, how they're managed, and how we deal with our programs regarding health. It's importantly done at the provincial level. Our decisions on how we're dealing with COVID is also done by our health authorities at the provincial level in collaboration with health regions. And that's the authority that speaks to us when we're talking about COVID regulations. In the EU context, it is in a sense a bit similar to that. So the responsibility of all things to do with health are national. But there is also a component that is at the EU level, and that's why I wrote down on my slide the single market. The single market is the 4 freedoms, so freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. And so insofar health policy can implicate a restriction in the single market, the European Union does have a role to play. So when we're thinking about this crisis erupting, the part that is single market is the free movement of goods and services and people. And the moment that the decision by member states has been made to restrict, let's say, travel or close borders, it already impacts some of the rules that were in place in the EU. On the other hand, the EU is created to help member states in times of need. So when this terrible catastrophe erupted in Italy, the Italians wrote to the European Commission and asked for help in the sense of personal protective equipment, hospital beds, all kinds of hardware that would help them deal with their immediate crisis. The European Commission didn't actually have the supplies needed to help Italy and asked the other member states. But they were at this stage so much in their fast burning stage of their crisis that they did not feel to send material to Italy. So there was a stage where Italy was actually getting equipment from China. And this showed the difficulty that the EU was faced with, this being a topic that has traditionally been national, but now really requiring coordination and collaboration from all the member states, but they're not being quite the same experience of what was the next step to take. So when in the very early days, it was such a scramble for how to deal with the immediate onset of the crisis. Europe's being, so the place of Europe in the global political and economic order was actually at that point severely challenged. People in Italy were wondering, what the heck is European integration when they actually need help? Nobody's coming to help. So this whole situation, particularly in the early days, led to a question of what is Europe, what should it do, and what are the next steps to be taken. So in my slide, I wrote down, faced with these extraordinary economic and political challenges, the EU had to come with a response. So on the short term, they had an emergency response of connecting with one another and providing information. And then as they were reflecting on what this crisis was all about, they also developed a number of medium-term measures. But the first weeks were very panicked in the EU context. I put a slide together here to give you an idea of the kinds of things that COVID-19 impacts, not just in the EU context, but within all of these advanced economies, but also in the developing world and the emerging economies. So there's an element that has to do with sort of China, migration, geopolitics. There's so many dimensions that this deals with, from research to governance to rights to how one deals with the media, communication. And as one goes into lockdown, the impact on arts and culture, on communities, on mental health, on how one does investment. So many dimensions are triggered by the activity that COVID-19 and the policies held to block it have impacted. So in the project that I mentioned to you before, what we've been trying to do is to examine the EU's response to the pandemic. And one of our motivations is to understand the role of the European Union as an institution vis-a-vis member states and their subnational units and how they responded to the crisis. And it's in particularly interesting for us as scholars of European integration to take this case study of the pandemic very seriously, because the European Union, in a sense, is what's often referred to as a sui generis international organization. So it is more than a sort of a classic international organization, but it's not quite a fully developed federation. It's basically a polity in the making. So this particular attack on the whole EU fabric gives it an opportunity either to sort of crumble and become less, or to strengthen and become more. And it's going to be early days to decide where it's at, but those are the questions that we have in mind when we're reflecting on these questions. Now, who are some of the actors that could respond? And in our earlier talks, we heard from Valerie Dearman and Keith about the role of the European Commission. So this is the authority that has the role of the government, the daily executive of the European Union. And this is a photo of the Berlaymont building in Brussels, where I was privileged to be at as a newly minted intern during my PhD degree. I was there for 5 months when they were negotiating the so-called Maastricht Treaty in 1991-92. Another set of institutions are those that are part of the legislative process, as well as those that are involved in setting the agenda of the European Union. And I've put here a photo of the leaders, the so-called heads of states or government of the European Union that have the member state presidents and prime ministers. You see in the center there, Chancellor Angela Merkel. They represent their member state, and they come together and set the agenda for the EU. So these institutions that play a role have different roles to play. So in the first days and weeks of the crisis, a lot of the decisions were made nationally or in the federal states, even at a lower level. And they responded mostly to the immediate urgency. And what we saw in the months of like February, March, was that governments of the member states responded right away just to the urgency of the moment. And as the time progressed and it was clear that too much of a single response by member states without clear collaboration could unravel the very fabric of the European Union, the member states were becoming a little bit more cognizant of the communication separate from collaboration with their counterparts in other countries. And they took a bit more time to coordinate their response before coming up with a national response, or at least communicating nationally. So what we're looking at in our project here is not just how the various institutions responded, but also when they responded and with what types of measures. And so as I've tried to demonstrate, the EU is one entity, but it's made up of all these other entities that all have their role to play in this governance system. So they can work together or apart. And of course, in other parts of the world, countries have experienced similar threats to their system. We've seen in these days, we see a number of countries having severe challenges to their fabric. We need not even remind ourselves of the difficult transition of power in the United States. Today, we have hyperinflation in Turkey. There's countries like Lebanon that are on the brink of completely collapsing. And all of these countries have not been helped very much by having, obviously, this big crisis on our hands. To what extent has the EU responded in a way that was similar or different from what others have done in the globe? And another question is the whole of the EU more than the sum of its parts, that is, the member states? So the effects of the pandemic across the world have been far-reaching in both economic, social, and political ways. So we've seen very high levels of unemployment emerging, particularly in that first year of the COVID crisis in 2020. I've put here a slide that I've taken from the OECD, showing that persons that were laid off as a person on temporary layoff as percentage of the labor force, and persons on not temporary layoff as percentage of the labor force. And we've seen that governments have responded to this crisis by offering a lot of temporary relief to companies to maintain their people and pay them for not doing anything, and also to invest in companies that otherwise may have fallen over. The result of this has been, of course, a very high public debt. The increase of the amount of debt owing to investors has increased dramatically. The public health systems have also been severely affected. In Canada, just like in other European Union member states, moments have happened where they had to downscale their usual health operations. All the operations that were elected operations have been suspended during the immediate height of the crisis, then got picked up again, and now in this wave, a number of them are being suspended again. We've seen repeated lockdowns, and not every country has had the same type of lockdown. So every member state in the European Union chose itself exactly what kind of lockdown they were looking for. There have been disruptions in the educational system. So some, as we have seen in Canada, similarly in Europe, there were differences across the EU. We have in Canada, of course, also seen differences in how much of a lockdown schools have experienced. We've seen limitation of personal liberties, not being able to walk out or not being able to speak freely or have masks. And also we've seen increasing social inequalities. Not everybody has been able to change their work from work from home, which has been a recommendation across much of the advanced world. So I mentioned at the very beginning that one of the elements of this particular crisis in the European Union context was to conceptualize this crisis as a so-called symmetric crisis. Now, you would ask yourself, what the heck is a symmetric crisis and why do we need to care about this? But in the language of macroeconomics, there is if one thinks about the development of a fiscal federalism, and we heard this in the presentation by Paul Schuer 2 weeks ago, in fiscal federalism, it is significant and relevant to know whether a crisis is hitting a part of the federation asymmetrically or not. So let's say you have a fully functioning economy, but a crisis emerges in one part of the economy and it doesn't hit the same in other parts of the economy. You have an asymmetric shock. And what you can then do is to have either these automatic stabilizers, so that you would then have maybe more unemployment in one element and then unemployment benefit flows into that part. Or you would have less taxes paid in the area that was depressed, and therefore it just also brings less to the financial coffers of the government. So an asymmetric shock would have an effect somewhere, but not somewhere else. And so this is seen as a symmetric crisis. So it's affected all countries roughly at the same time. So countries couldn't really avoid getting this virus. It may have been a little bit longer or shorter, but it wasn't fundamentally different. Yet the crisis was seen as very different from those that came before. For example, the three other crises that had hit the EU were the 2007-2008 financial crisis, the 2009-2015 sovereign debt crisis, and the 2015-16 migration crisis. These were three very disruptive moments in the EU, but these were all to some extent conceptualized by the European Union as some kind of a shock that was referred to as a policy failure. So there was maybe more of a shock in some countries. For example, the sovereign debt crisis did not hit everybody the same way, because in some countries they had to start off, they had let's say a lower public debt than other countries, or they were not extended massively on private debt. Or they had, in the case of the financial crisis, they were heavily based on mortgages overstretched, or they had asset-based securities in their portfolios. And in the case of the migration crisis, there was the sense that these migration waves were coming to some parts of the European Union, but not to all. There had been a rule where member states would take up migrants where they would first land and would just process that. And so some people said it's not really everybody's problem at the same time. So all of these earlier crises were sort of seen as maybe related to policy making, maybe not everybody's issue at the same time. This crisis was seen as nobody could have seen it coming, and nobody could have really done anything differently. So it was seen as hitting everybody at the same time. And there was not this worry about what's called moral hazard. So the idea that you help them and then they were going to do more poor policies because they know if they do poor policies, then somebody will help them out. And therefore it would be maybe a problem to reward bad policies. And this had been a notion that had been floating around in these earlier crises, at least to some extent, not in all different dimensions. But here it was actually the reverse. When needing to think about how to respond, one of the points that was put to the fore was that this is a crisis hitting everybody. You couldn't have known anything about it, couldn't have prepared for it. And it's in a sense a little bit random how it hits a particular country worse than others. And therefore it could be, one could make a link to this need for solidarity and providing support. And so in this next bullet point, whether or not and under what conditions to provide conditional or unconditional support, the language that was used was that this in principle should be something that the EU as a whole should give support to, and that if there were conditions, maybe they had to be connected to earlier plans that the EU had put in place to ask member states to deal with some of these underlying imperfections. But clearly it wasn't that they were that those underlying conditions were causing the result. It was more that that was there anyway. And maybe there's a way now to kind of encourage member states to deal with these issues as they are now providing more funds to these member states. So the COVID-19 crisis was conceptualized. The narrative that was developed was had very little to do with what member states' policies were all about. So the pandemic offered a reminder to provide this solidarity, to cooperate across borders, and to highlight the benefits of international cooperation in a transboundary setting, and to work towards joint problem solving. Having said that, having started off this slide with a talk about the symmetric crisis, the pandemic may have come in a way like to all of these member states roughly at the same time. It didn't exactly have the same effect on all member states. So if we go to our analysis of what we're seeing here, the long-term, the key issues at stake in the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic can be put in the context of the long-term evolution of the EU. So the EU has already for many years been struggling with this question of sort of deepening economic and political integration, or maybe a more loose form of cooperation. And it's not insignificant that this pandemic occurs exactly at the same time as the United Kingdom leaves the EU. This is, in a sense, a total fluke, but at the same time, something that was quite fundamental for the way in which the EU could respond. The United Kingdom had, over the past 3 crises that I highlighted on my previous slide, been of the opinion that the European integration process should not deepen, so that coordination should be looser, and that trying to deal with the crisis shouldn't move to deepened collaboration. France and Germany, by contrast, had been much more interested in deepening the collaboration. They had been at the forefront of for example, the project of creating the single currency. They were together in the Schengen project, the project that takes away borders between the member states. And so they had on quite a number of areas, of issue areas, much deeper intent in collaboration than the United Kingdom had. And during all of these previous crises before the COVID-19 crisis comes, it is at difficult times for the EU to come up with a joint response. For instance, during the financial crisis or the sovereign debt crisis, to come up with possible deepening effects like a banking union, or to move towards norms on public debt, the United Kingdom was continuously not in agreement with the deepening component of it. So now, as the United Kingdom leaves on the 31st of January 2020, and in February we have these first really major developments around the COVID-19 crisis, it does give the EU the first time to think about how does the EU want to do this. Nevertheless, the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned, generated these tensions between the EU and its member states concerning this distribution of competencies, right? So health is a national competence, the single market is an EU competence. When it has to do with immediate urgency, the EU can do something. Member states have the possibility to decide on things that are of national concern. So it has been very difficult for the EU to sort out what is national and what is EU. In fact, what the EU has done has taken this crisis to say, maybe this is a signal of the EU needs to be able to do a little bit more. So in this period of time, the EU kind of reached out and decided, is this not maybe the time to expand in areas where we have conceptualized the need to do a bit more, but we haven't found the political support, didn't see the reason. And now at this particular crisis, it might be possible to see why it would be necessary to do a little bit more. So if we're thinking about fiscal federalism in the EU only has 1% of all of the gross domestic product of the European Union to spend on EU things. And that includes those buildings I showed you a moment ago, the whole bureaucracy, but also funds on things like common agricultural policy, regional policy, education, research. I mean, all of that, military, many of these things are all within that 1%. That's not very much. Most advanced economies have spent easily 40% of the GDP through government expenditure. So what the EU can do in terms of offering a sort of a fiscal counterpart to, for example, a central bank or any area in the single market is very, very limited. So the moment you want to do redistributive policies, you may need to first collect the money and then give it out. And that is something that the EU didn't have a lot of ability to do. And as soon as you're doing those kinds of redistributions, the question about how the EU may be treating, let's say, the North versus the South or the East versus the West, and the question of whether there'll be winners and losers from using these funds for some group or another group, then become more salient. So there was, to some extent, the challenge regarding what does the EU do for those in need, but there was also more generally a growing political discontent with what the EU could do. And so some citizens don't feel connected to what the EU is able to provide. And in a sense, the effect of the pandemic as a manifestation of globalization also came to the fore. So Brexit, the phenomenon of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, had been analyzed as being in part citizens not liking that they felt that globalization has passed them by. If one analyzes where the voters were who did not like to stay in the EU, there was a very small difference between those wanting to remain and those wanting to leave. There were like 48% wanted to remain and 52% wanted to leave. But if you unpackage that, the largest chunk of people were in sort of the areas in England where there had been industrial decline. Most of the voters were sort of lower income persons with maybe job losses recently, having to change their professions, and clearly feeling that this whole flow of globalization, where some industrial towns have become have lost their employment, led to a number of these people feeling left behind. And so this phenomenon we've also seen in the United States, in some of the Rust Belt states and so on, a feeling that globalization may not be good for everybody. So the effects of the crisis and management has also had an effect on public opinion and political parties. So in the early days, there was a lot of what they call in political science rallying around the flag. So very much support for the way governments dealt with the pandemic. But over time, as the crisis didn't go away and the restrictions are high and citizens just don't see light at the end of the tunnel, there's increasingly more disgruntlement with governments taking these difficult decisions and not being able to fully get the virus under control. This whole pandemic has also led to further international cooperation, so cross-border and regional and international political and economic cooperation. So as we are looking at these steps that have been taken, so the response from EU institutions, so EU institutions were in fact amongst the first to respond to the crisis. They didn't have a lot of tools, but the tools they had, they did use. So the EU engaged in a sort of a cooperative, we call in political science, positive sum game. So not a conflict between the Commission and the Council, which could have happened, and also not really a conflict between supranational institutions and the sort of intergovernmental ones. And so this is a big difference from what we saw in the early years of the sovereign debt crisis in the Euro area, the period between 2009 and 2015. It took a very long time for the various institutions and also the member states to kind of know what they wanted to do. And during the financial sovereign debt crisis, they took a long time to build new institutional structures. For example, something called the European semester was created during that time that made the member states have tools to work with macroeconomic policy coordination. But then even when the sovereign debt crisis was over, the period between 2015 and 2019 was still a period where it was very precarious growth. It was low growth, but also very low inflation rates, even deflation, so negative interest rates. So the tools that the EU had was quite limited before even the COVID-19 crisis erupted. So with this COVID-19 crisis, the decision to come up with a policy response was a bit of a challenge. And so as it so happened, the fact that it was sort of like a demand shock where people were not working anymore and just not going to the shops and so on didn't create a sort of an inflation spike that we now in fact do see, but we saw people just not buying anything. And then the fiscal stimulus, so what governments did is to keep people's income going and to make sure that nobody was massively, or not nobody, where not as many people lost their jobs or not as many companies collapsed as would have been if governments hadn't stepped in. That mix seemed to have hit the spot in those early days. And so this response is in that sense very different from the previous crises where the European Central Bank ended up having to do a lot of the work. So it ran what's called a loose monetary policy. So it was able to accept a lot of funds as collateral and then giving money to banks and to kind of keep money flowing. But the governments at the EU level weren't doing that much. And they often, in fact, required what we refer to as austerity measures, right? So asking governments to cut expenditure as opposed to adding money to the economy. And here's a picture of the European Central Bank, another beautiful building. So this got expanded during the previous crisis when the banking supervision arm also was given to this institution. So I promised you that I'd say a little bit about what the European Central Bank has done, which is in fact this other paper in our special issue that I've written with Lucia Quaglia. We just finished just earlier a week ago. Anybody's interested, by all means, ask us and we're happy to send that your way. So I have here 2 videos and I'm going to hope that it's going to start. If not, I'll just leave it out. But let me see if I can show you something that happened in 2012.
There's another message that I want to tell you.
Okay, I'm asking, is it showing or no? Probably have to screen share again. Let me just.
I don't see anything coming up.
I'll do it one more time. Here we go. This is Mario Draghi. He's the president of the European Central Bank in 2012. And he makes a very important speech and it's a very short video. Here you go. 18
There's another message that I want to tell you today is that within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
So that's the first video I wanted to share with you. And so it may sound very banal, 18 seconds of it, but that completely calmed the markets.
Most central bank governors woken up in the morning.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to have to do this one again.
Tapestry of life will offer
sorry.
Today.
And
no one
I have another one that I want. Okay, back to my slide. Sorry, I had a bit of a Okay, and the second one I wanted to show you is Christine Lagarde. So this is 8 years later. And let me start that one. Give me 2 seconds to do the technology that goes with this. So we're now 8 years later, and the president of the European Central Bank, her name is Christine Lagarde. She's a French politician, a lawyer, and this is on the 12th of March. So the pandemic has just been announced. Christine Lagarde is in a press conference. She's given her formal speech, and she's taking questions from the audience, and she says the following, 20 seconds.
We will be there, as I said earlier on, using full flexibility, but we are not here to close spreads. This is not the function or the mission of the ECB. There are other tools for that, and there are other actors to actually deal with those issues. We will be.
So let me see if I've got my screen now completely off. So what's relevant there? Go to my slide again. 1 second. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm back again. Okay. So what we saw here is 2 really short clips. One, ECB President Mario Draghi says he will do whatever it takes, and believe me, it will be enough. And from incredibly high spikes and super high cost of funding for many countries in Southern Europe, it all came down in a relatively short period of time. Lagarde is taken aback by a question by a journalist asking about their response. And she basically says that the ECB is not here to close spreads. That means that the difference between some member states in terms of how much they have to pay to borrow money and another member state, that they're not going to do something to change that. And she was intending to say something differently. She meant to say member states are responsible for spending money, and it's not the central bank that does that. But the result was the biggest single day effect on the Italian stock exchange, and it had an immediate negative effect. And so it was very clear that the communication was suboptimal, to say the least. And so within 1 week, the European Central Bank turns it around and comes up with a fantastically large pandemic emergency purchase program, the PEPP. Again, one of these unconventional monetary policy measures to temporarily purchase assets. And so first they had an envelope of 750 billion euros for this in March, this week after making this public relations blip. Then in June, another 600 billion euro was added. And then in December of 2020, another 500 billion. So in total, 1.85 trillion euros put in an envelope to be able to do purchases. And so that was a significant chunk of money, but it's also super fast, right? So between, if we think about the sovereign debt crisis having started in 2009 and Mario Draghi in 2012 coming up with a whatever it takes speech, this is the crisis erupts in January, February. We get the 11th of March announcement of it being a pandemic, the 12th of March blip. And then by a week later, there's this huge package. So this is a very fast response in terms of what the ECB has done. And in our paper, we talk a bit about how the ECB was able to learn some of these lessons from the past in terms of realizing the importance of making a fast move. So in addition to the European Central Bank, the governments of the European Union, together with the European Union member states, the daily executive, the European Commission, come up with a new package. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the EU only has 1% to deal with normal budgets. But what they did here was to say, let's take the EU budget, but also add a new recovery instrument, a new temporary facility. And they refer to this as a recovery and resilience facility, which is at the heart of a budget called the Next Generation EU. And that is money that can be drawn in from markets through loans and grants given to the member states based on packages that the member states propose. But they can then get money from the European Commission at the rates that the European Commission can borrow, right? Because the reason why people were worried about these so-called spreads was that if you are a country in need, then if you go to the market and want to borrow, your interest rates are going to be higher than if you are collectively borrowing money and then giving it to the member states. So by channeling the reputation of the EU as a whole and then giving those money out in forms of loans and grants to the member states, you can actually make a significant contribution as the EU, so to say. So this is another facility that was created in response to the pandemic. And so this is a picture that shows you what they had in mind. So 672 billion euros, and then some parts in grants and loans. And these numbers sometimes change because they made a decision in the summer of 2020, and then it took them some time to kind of put it all into legal text, and then they redid the numbers with 2021 euros, and it's a little bit different, but that's okay. Roughly speaking, you can see it's a huge package. So all the forms of cooperation. So as I mentioned, after this scramble in the early weeks, the European integration process, in a sense, emerged. So they had cooperation through using virtual video conferencing to coordinate policies, which had not been the standard practice amongst EU member states. Funding on research on vaccines, coordination on vaccines, so EU-level contracts to buy the vaccines, so that you didn't have all these individual countries come up with vaccine contracts with the providers, sharing of personal protection equipment, cooperation on joint policy, so coordinating things on testing strategy, on sort of border control policies, on the green pass that they have in Europe for passing borders. They have one system for the whole EU, and again, sharing hospital capacity when member states are in need. Of course, nothing happens without there also being some backlash. We've seen this throughout the whole advanced economies, where some anti-vaxxers or people generally unhappy with how the funds have been distributed amongst the various socioeconomic groups, people have come up and protested either the choices of the policies of the governments or whether they have been dealt with at the proportional level. So we're thinking about the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for understanding European integration, and putting an eye on the clock. I have about a minute left before it's 11 o'clock. John, shall I finish off this slide, or did you want to have me stop a minute and then have the break and then come back?
No, I think now's a good time to stop, actually.
Okay, I'll leave this slide up and we'll take a 5-minute break.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy, let's carry on, shall we?
All right, thank you very much. I just grabbed myself a nice little beverage. So if we now turn to, I've got 2 more slides, this lesson one, and then there's a concluding slide. So if we go to the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for understanding sort of European integration, the component I offered in the beginning to speak about regarding our theoretical understanding. So the first question that we hear in the EU context, and Valerie Derman also spoke about this, is this question about supranational or intergovernmental. So the EU conceptualized as an international organization would be one that is characterized as an intergovernmental organization. The EU characterized as a federation would be one that is characterized as more supranational, so that more powers are done at the EU level, where citizens and governments, national governments, have transferred powers over to the EU level. And so from this episode, we're not exactly sure how this has changed the balance. I would venture to say that there would be a bit more supranationalism, so a little bit more transfer towards the EU, but not really as much as some of the sort of neo-functional thinkers may have thought back in the 50s and 60s when this was conceptualized. So it remains a bit this dance between member states and EU integration. Who is the most important actor? This is a perennial question. The European Commission has traditionally been seen as the government of the EU, and if the EU will move towards a final state of increasing integration, one could expect that European Commission to become more and more important. And so here the jury's again out at the moment. We see the European Commission play a much more prominent role, and it has managed to do a good number of things regarding coordination of vaccines, for instance, but it has also been criticized. For example, in the vaccine negotiations, the idea of getting good prices for everybody was appreciated, and making sure there was no fight over some countries hoarding all of the vaccines against weaker countries. So that was a good thing. But then the Commission didn't have the experience of negotiating with these kinds of companies. And therefore, when AstraZeneca then provided more of their vaccines to the United Kingdom and Israel, the European Union looked a bit weak in that context. So again, the Commission has increased its abilities, but it hasn't become, it's not the breaking point or the breakthrough point. What are some of the mechanisms that we see in sort of that we can take from theoretical literature on European integration? So classic mechanisms are the one I already mentioned a moment ago, namely a sort of a functional mechanism. The idea that the policies will be done there where they can be most effectively delivered, so that you have sort of welfare optimization. So again, if you have a green card on your cell phone and you want to cross borders, it makes functional sense to negotiate that amongst the member states, so that when you travel, you have like one QR code that every border recognizes, right? So then it works for all of the EU. That makes a lot of sense. But again, if you think about who would decide when to lock down which region, obviously that's not something that would have to be decided at the highest level. So the functionalism is to kind of find where you would do integration depending on the functional usefulness of that kind of idea. Another mechanism is hanging on to power. So what the United Kingdom had been calling during the Brexit crisis, take back control. So the idea of having sovereignty, authority, control, and that can be a mechanism that will be held onto even when it's not functionally optimal. And in the COVID crisis, one could argue that in those early days, this notion of control and sovereignty played up first, and that only in the second round, so after, let's say, April and onwards, was that sort of knee-jerk reaction, the underbelly feeling suppressed, and was coordination done before public announcements were made in member states. So these two mechanisms were both at play. More dominant was the sort of the control side in the first period, and more on the cooperation side in the second period. How about policy learning? I argued in the piece on the European Central Bank that we've seen quite a bit of policy learning from the earlier crisis to this particular COVID crisis, insofar as the importance of taking decisions. In the sovereign debt crisis, which lasted 6 years, academic research has suggested that it would not have been as bad had the European Union been able to make quicker decisions, because it escalated because of the lack of decision. I demonstrated with the two little clips with the Whatever It Takes by Mario Draghi that happened quite a far end into the crisis and then calmed down the markets considerably. And then the president, Christine Lagarde, who very quickly in the beginning makes this mistake, but then super quickly corrects this. So understanding the importance of the communication of the central bank, for instance, and learning about the toolkit that can be used to deal with the crisis. Some people argue that the European Union in crisis can actually be seen as an element that helps it move forward. So that having to do things, making the EU relevant, as some people have jokingly or not so jokingly called the bicycle theory. If a bicycle is standing still, it will fall over. If it's moving forward, it actually can stay upright. And the EU, in a sense, benefits from having to do things. So having crises, although in public media might be seen as a negative thing for the EU, is also a way to kind of show what it needs to do, what is the next step. In terms of widening versus deepening, a few slides ago, I mentioned that the United Kingdom had been always having difficulties with further deepening. Now, with the UK out and the member states being focused on what can be achieved, there is a bit more of a balance towards further deepening rather than widening. Widening would be to add more countries to the EU. We have not heard much about that, although below the surface, we do see some activities in that direction. The United Kingdom, having left exactly at the right time for the EU to be in a good position to deal only with the pandemic, was helpful. Although if I had to give another talk on Brexit, I could argue that the UK was not completely out. It was formally out, but the relationships between the EU and the UK were not settled. But let's leave that for another day. So what are some of the likely next steps? So the EU, of course, is still in the midst of its fourth wave, and it has to deal with the corona pandemic that's happening right now with Omicron and having to come up with next steps. So these this is still a work in progress. Okay, you can hear me still?
Yes, yes, you're coming through fine.
I had a moment where I would press mute accidentally, and not unintentionally. Okay, so let me conclude. So let us return to answer the following questions. So how has the EU responded to the pandemic and why? So I would argue that initially there was a knee-jerk reaction at the national level, but that increasingly there were cooperative steps taken and even some steps towards deeper integration. We won't exactly know yet how much of this deeper integration will stay or whether this is temporary, but what has been achieved in terms of providing a fiscal stimulus at the EU level to member states in need as a significant step forward in terms of deepening integration. The second question is, what have been the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic for institutions, policies, and politics? And so I think there are some repercussions involving a rethink of the institutions, the mode of governance, policies, and politics. And with the EU, if you like, gone, some of these veto points may be now out of the way, and there can be a further think. I mentioned that in our workshop that we're doing next week, we also have a talk on the rule of law, and there are some member states that are not as happy with where the EU is going. They are almost taking on some of the role that the UK has taken before. So it's not as if everything is done, but I think there is more of an opportunity for the EU to rethink where it is and what might be the next steps in terms of governance, policies, and politics. What lessons can we learn about the theories? I would argue that the European integration is still, European integration process is still looking for the right balance between these intergovernmental and supranational tendencies, but we may have seen a bit more of a shift towards the more supranational. So that concludes my presentation. I welcome the question and answer period. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so very much. I was going to ask if you'd exit screen sharing, and so we can all see you in full. And maybe people would like to put their displays on gallery so that we can all see each other. Now, let me try and do that. So, please, if you have any questions of Amy or any comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to unmute your microphone and jump in. But I'd like to start out by saying that I really enjoyed this presentation, and it was interesting to go back to the very start in January when you described how Italy first was the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. And just reflect on that for a moment, because I think we all remember over a year, or 2 years ago in January last year, how Italy was really took it on the chin and really started the whole question of how do we deal with it. So it's obviously been a crisis, as Amy has very clearly said, perhaps the fourth crisis in the last, 15 years or so, financial, sovereign, and the migration crisis. And I come to the question that I ask all the speakers, Amy, the future of the EU. You had said something that stuck in my mind was crumble and become less, or strengthen and become more. And I thought that was a very good possibility in either direction. I wonder why you land on that, whether or not you think that it's likely in the future, and not necessarily the immediate future, but perhaps the distant future. Do you think the EU will strengthen or will it crumble?
Yeah, so I always find these questions very difficult, because it's one of the reasons why the whole Brexit referendum was so unsatisfactory, and you can see the devastation that this country is going through. Personally, I don't necessarily think I should have an opinion on whether the United Kingdom should be in the EU or outside of the EU. But I think it's very difficult for 60 million people to make a yes/no decision on something that is incredibly complex. And although I feel I'm a little bit more informed than maybe your standard 1/60th of a million people in the United Kingdom, it still is the case that even with the amount of energy that I can put on understanding the EU, I know I only know a little component of it. And all of the EU is all of those things, right? And so to kind of move it forward into saying, this is the only thing that I can see, and therefore I know if it's more or less, I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful. The other thing is that I think the EU isn't a steady state. And so it responds all the time to little attacks that it feels on its system. And it's the addition of all of the little decisions it makes that makes for where it is at any given point in time. I personally think there is no reason to believe that the EU is going to crumble and disappear, because I think it's resilient enough that all those who are making the EU contribute to making these steps so that one can collaborate more and work together in the areas where they can do more. I actually think that a lot of our problems would benefit from having a global government. So a lot of the problems can be created because the level of government where the problem is should not be the nation state, but should be beyond the nation state. And the European Union is in the first attempt at trying to do global governance with sovereign states, and willingness to make rules at the higher level that all the member states then participate in. And so some problems are problems of humanity and of the planet. And having an instrument to make those decisions is making it possible to deal with some of those issues.
So at the global level, you'd perhaps see the United Nations playing a role as on the global equivalence of the EU, as it were?
So I think the United Nations is a good example of an international organization. So there is decisions made at the EU level, at the global level in the United Nations. But for example, the United Nations Security Council has veto players in there. So if you're not in line with the interest of a particular country, that country can block all of what everybody decides. And there are also decisions that need to be agreed to by everybody. And so it is the lowest common denominator that then eventually happens. And some things are just not decided because they cannot agree on it collectively.
Thank you. And now, Angus, you had a question, I think, of Amy, which was to perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the last slide. Not the last slide, the penultimate last slide.
Let me see if I can...
with a graph.
Yeah, the one that I showed with the support. I think it was this one. Is that the right one?
Yeah, well, it seems like a large number of people disagree that the European Union...
Yes, yeah. So what I tried to say in my slide a few slides ago is that the EU got a lot of support early on, sort of governments, and it was able to respond in a way that people felt they did well. But as the pandemic has emerged, there's more disagreement about what has happened. And this slide here shows us how the people in the EU have felt that the European Union has been able to live up to the pandemic. So has the EU lived up to its needs in the pandemic time? And you could see that again, you have to define what responsibilities are and who see this, but the red is basically no, has not met, and then blue is yes. So you could see on the whole, people are not necessarily super excited about what the EU has done. So that's one that shows that there's still a lot of work to do amongst citizens.
Very good. So, well, thank you very much for giving us really a very useful lecture, in that I feel that COVID, one of its benefits, if there is a benefit to COVID, particularly in the EU context, has enabled us to see how the EU really works, or could work, or has responded to the crises which seem to come along from time to time to test it. And so ending the series with this presentation has enabled us to review and revisit the issues around supernatural and supranational, I should get that right, and intergovernmental divisions and tendencies. So this has been a very illuminating lecture from that point of view. It's enabled us to reflect back on all the other presentations, and you referred back from time to time in the course of your presentation on other speakers' points of view. The policy learning aspect intrigued me in that it certainly seems that the EU is evolving, and I loved your bicycle theory, where it has to be moving forward so it won't fall over. I thought that was very, very illustrative of what might be happening in the EU, that it is evolving, and it has to evolve to survive. I guess that's a Darwinian principle as well. So it's very useful analog. So Amy, on behalf of everybody here, I don't see anybody else in the chat line, or anybody would like to raise their hand and make a comment, or I think I've got everybody on the screen. So please jump in if you have a question. Donald, you have your hand raised. Would you like
yes,
to?
Yes, I have a question. Health in Canada is a provincial responsibility. Is there any learnings from how the EU has struggled with its national versus supranational organization of health? Are there any learnings that we maybe should look at the provincial systems here in Canada, trying to rethink how things are done?
Yeah, so maybe, Donald, I will invite you to attend our outreach event that I mentioned at the very beginning, because I have 4 speakers that are going to make that connection. So Canada-EU lessons. And so this lecture, and I can give John the information, he can send it to all of you. It will be on the 9th of December from 7 a.m. Pacific time for 2 hours with the Canadian ambassador to the EU and Lou Pauly, Frédéric Meyrand, and Kathy Brock, who are speaking about these topics. But from what I know and why I put it together, and our lessons that I've actually seen already, but I mean, I think they are the leading authorities. But I think one of the things we've learned in Canada is how difficult it is to manage a really large territory with relatively few people and specific needs on the ground. And so what the European Union has to do that is similar to what Canada has to do is to kind of have the coordination going on between the various levels, and it still make the decisions that are suitable to what is going on the ground. So if you pull your decisions too high, then you're making a decision that is too big for everybody, and it's not appropriate to, for example, restrict people's movements if there isn't that much COVID going on. At the same time, you don't want to be doing things and then not coordinate. So you have, I don't know, different health passes. You can't cross borders. You haven't coordinated on a single pass that you can use to have a QR code, this kind of thing. So I think there are good things you need to cooperate on. And then there's moments where you look at the information on the ground to decide what is the better way to deal with it.
Yes, we have, I don't know what your name is, but it comes up on the screen as Robertson, M. Robertson.
It's Margaret Robertson.
Oh, Margaret, please go ahead.
How do we get the link for the Thursday roundtable?
Yeah, I will send it to John, and John can send it to all of you.
Thank you very much. It sounds very interesting.
So what I'm suggesting that we do is that when we downloaded or uploaded, I'm never sure which, the recording, we send that out in an email to everybody, and we'll include in the email the links that Amy's talking about.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I will put it in the chat now, but I know not everybody can keep the chat. So if you write it down, then this should do it. But so it gives you the information, and it would be able for you to register, because if you register, you get the link. So that's, but we'll do it again so that we don't lose it. And you're very welcome to come. I would love to have people from the community be part of that roundtable. And there's also an opportunity to ask questions. It will be a webinar, but there'll be time for Q&A towards the end. So thank you. I really appreciate you guys coming.
Amy, you have an incredible ability to multitask. It's something I'm incapable of doing. So to be able to write in the chat line at the same time, having a hard enough time reading the chat line and speaking, never mind writing it. So anybody else got anything they'd like to say, not only just about this, but about the series as a whole? If you've enjoyed it, or perhaps your thoughts on perhaps the next series that we might have in terms of what I call the Understanding series. This is the second one. As you know, we spoke about China, understanding China, before we came to the EU. So if you have any suggestions, as I think I mentioned last week, another way you can do this is to email me, and I'll put that in the email distribution to everybody. But it would be nice to get your feedback on what other parts of the globe that we might want to have a series to cover. So again, I hope everybody has enjoyed this series, and I thank all our speakers. And of course, today I particularly want to thank, on behalf of Elder Academy and the University of Victoria Retirees Association, I want to thank everybody for coming, and for all the speakers, and for Amy particularly today. Now, I think I just saw something pop up in the chat line. Will this webinar be recorded so if members are not able to attend? I think you're referring there to the webinar next week. Yes, the webinar. Gosh, this multitasking is very good. So Amy's replying, yes, it will be recorded. Is there anything else that we can cover? If not, I'm just going to finish off by saying that everybody is invited to our next series. Well, it's not really a series; it's a one-off, and it's the one being offered by us to invite Kevin Hall, Dr. Kevin Hall, the president of UVic. And he's going to speak to us on December the 18th. I think you've all received notices of this particular talk. His talk is going to be all over the map. That's the title of the talk. And this is really an opportunity for us to get to know Dr. Hall a little bit more. And it will be at the same time on a Saturday morning. So you've got a couple of Saturdays off here between now and the 18th of December. And look forward perhaps to seeing everybody again on the 18th of December. I think there's a question on the chat. Just let me read out from Norma. Are there plans to continue the Understanding series next year? We have not scheduled anything, Norma. We've got a fairly full program next year, different series for 6 of the months. You can see what the topics are if you go onto our web page, our plans for next year, but we have not included an Understanding series. We may well do that, given the level of interest that there might be. So, well, with that in mind, obviously we're approaching Christmas, so I wish you every health and happiness for the upcoming season, and I look forward to seeing you all again on the 18th of December. And thanks again, Amy, for joining us today and wrapping up this series. And thanks to everybody for joining. So with that, I'll conclude the meeting.
Thanks very much, Sean, and also for putting this together and for reaching out to us to make the series possible. I really appreciate that.
Well, you made it very easy to do it. You've got a tremendous resource there. The university has a an excellent center of excellence in European matters, and it's wonderful to know that we have this resource available to you. We wish you all the best with all your work, and your colleagues too, and continuing to look at the EU, and we'll no doubt be following it in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So with that, I'll end the meeting, and off we go.